Montreal is a weird place. It's among my favorite cities in the world for its urban transformation, arts and design scene, and fantastic metro system. And then I remember the incredibly dysfunctional public transit plans. Ah, but what about the REM, you say? I love the REM, but it's not a perfect project, and it was only possible because it circumvented the formal transit planning process. And while that gave us a good transit line, it has some inherent issues, like being hard to replicate and still likely costing more than it needed to. That being said, when the REM de l'Est to Montreal East and Montreal North was announced, I was incredibly excited. And I was really hoping we could get one more big project done before the brakes were slammed on Montreal's public transportation expansion for another generation. But with what we know now, my optimism wasn't only misplaced, but the reality we found ourselves in is even crazier. Because after the REM de l'Est was cancelled, we moved to a much worse automated metro plan, and now all things look to be pointing to a long-term fascination Montreal has had: trams. This is all despite the current mayor campaigning on more metro. So what happened here, and can the situation be salvaged? Let's talk about it. With the REM now open, I've never been more convinced that the city made the right decision with this project, which more than doubled the city's rapid transit network in terms of its reach, and which is already mesmerizing residents with its incredible views of the skyline and the mountain. But the REM has also made me reflect on what could have been. The Eastern REM saga was incredibly frustrating. And if you want to learn more about it, there's an incredibly good documentary-style series on the REM with one episode dedicated to it from Paige Saunders. I'll link it up here. What's funny in retrospect is that a big part of what killed the REM de l'Est plan was the leaked STM and ARTM report, which brought up a ton of very strange criticisms with the project. These criticisms are ones that the media decided to amplify before first even questioning. Things like the obvious need to redesign the bus networks in the east of Montreal to better align with the new project, or the unlikely cannibalization of ridership on the Green Line, or the incredibly frustrating, but not really unique to Montreal assertion that the REM wouldn't have a ton of value if it didn't serve a ton of new public transit journeys. What's frustrating is that a big part of why these concerns apparently were taken so seriously was the credibility of the traditional public transit agencies. That's despite the fact that these same agencies are advancing and trying to advance projects that have tons of problems. And that's all before we talk about the crazy posturing about how no city builds elevated rail, even as cities from Vancouver to Copenhagen, Paris, and Montreal with the first phase of the REM all do that. I would go into more detail about why elevated rail is actually fine, but Oh the Urbanity has a fantastic video on exactly that subject, so I recommend you go check that one out instead. Around a year and a half after the project, which was renamed the Eastern Structuring Project, had been taken over, a report was released on the subject which was crazy. I did an entire live stream about it. The report was not really about trying to talk about transit projects that could be built for Montreal, which is the ARTM's mandate, and instead it was NIMBY fuel for the future, talking about why elevated rail is unacceptable in Montreal, and making crazy assertions like the idea that elevated rail, even in industrial areas, including next to an oil refinery, would be socially unacceptable. Because of this, the claim was made that the entire project had to be underground, and yet despite the fact that the trains would be smaller than on, say, the Montreal Metro, the plan's projected cost was more than the entire existing metro system in inflation-adjusted terms. I don't say this lightly, but the report was an insult to everyone's collective intelligence, and at the same time, I really do believe that NIMBYs will be grabbing pictures from it for decades to try to oppose affordable transit projects. And what will we end up building instead? Probably more roads, because it's what we know how to build. What's worse though is that this report laid the groundwork for the pivot of the century. Well, since our less extensive plan clearly needs to cost 3 times more than the original REM de l'Est plan, obviously the solution here is a tram. And it's not a surprise to me that the ARTM appears to want a tram. But wanting to use a particular transit mode is the wrong approach. You should look at a project and find a mode that fits, not decide a mode and then make it fit to the project. Why is there this obsession with trams? Well, I would imagine it's because Montreal is one of the largest French-speaking cities in the world without any. But building a tram just because it's the thing you want to do misses the point of actually trying to do it in the right place or in the right way. The whole situation makes me incredibly frustrated, if you can't already tell. The agency took a project it didn't like, morphed it into a worse project, and then decided that that project had to be scuttled completely. And because that project, which was obviously unworkable, was politically unpopular, the proposal is now just to build the wrong form of transit, in the form of a tram. And to be perfectly clear, I like trams. I recently wrote a Substack article, which will be linked down below, about the tram in Quebec City, which is a decent project. And make sure to subscribe to my Substack. It's free and you'll get articles like that delivered weekly. But the reality here is that trams have a place, and a suburban line where riders will be forced to switch to the metro to head into the city center is not that place. If Montreal wanted to build trams where they make sense, based on best practice from around the world, they'd look at building something like the plan Marco Kitty drafted up on Twitter. Yes, I'm talking about actually implementing a Twitter transit plan. Marco's a really cool guy. This plan would take some short but very busy bus services across the city and replace them with new tram routes. This would reduce the operating costs of those bus routes, make them more reliable, and upgrade everyone's service. But that's not happening, because as evidenced by claims such as,
"There is no place in Montreal where elevated metro makes any sense for social acceptability,"
trying to learn from other places is just not in the cards for Montreal right now. And before anyone says it, tram trains are not the solution here. Tram trains make a lot of sense when you're trying to connect cities and small towns along existing rail corridors, not when you're trying to build a discount metro system. What's unfortunate about all of this is that the REM de l'Est would have brought the north and east of the island closer together, in the same way the original REM line has brought the South Shore closer to Montreal's urban core. The reality is, trams are just far too slow to have that distance compressing effect across the entire island of Montreal. And that's just sort of inherent to trams. If trams were faster traveling through urban areas, they would drive more demand and you'd need a metro. And if trams were faster traveling through suburban areas, you would again drive more demand and you'd want to build heavy suburban rail. This is why trams are typically used for short urban lines with lots of stops packed together, and not for the backbone of large city-spanning networks. Of course, a tram also wouldn't provide a service frequency and span that's competitive with the REM. Peak hour frequencies with the tram will probably be something like every 7 minutes, which is the absolute lowest frequency that you see on the current REM line. And the reality is, it just isn't practical to run trams as frequently as a metro. They don't have an entirely dedicated right of way, and it's very expensive because every single vehicle needs a driver. This is why many cities with big tram networks have historically buried the city center portions, such as in many German cities. But as you start to build more and more of a tram network separate from the road network, your costs start to tend towards that of a metro line or a REM, but with less frequency and vehicles that just aren't adapted for that type of service. You only need to look to Ottawa to see some of the problems that can happen with operating low-floor vehicles on a metro-style service. Trams are like any form of transit. They make sense in some places and not in others. With a tram line in the suburbs, Montreal might make parts of the city more attractive for new development, but these places will not become truly urban. And because the travel time on a tram to get to the center of the city will be so long, these parts of the city won't become integrated into the cohesive urban fabric of Montreal that people love. With the REM, you essentially bring suburbs closer to the city center. This is a step change in transit quality and the competitiveness of transit compared to, say, driving. It's the kind of transit that leads to non-commute trips actually being made on the train, and people getting rid of their car, or at least one of their cars. But with the tram, you mostly just make the existing bus service better. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's not transformative, and it's certainly not worth multiple billions of dollars. You're making suburbs better, but you're not shifting around geography, all while still spending a lot of very important transit funding. You can really see the impact of removing the REM in the regional transportation network. With 2 REM lines, you'd be able to travel from the South Shore to Montreal North, or from the east of the island to the airport quickly with 1 transfer in under an hour. But because the tram is slower, requires more transfers, and doesn't provide as much additional capacity, you just don't see the same region-shaping benefits. Essentially, you're building a larger network, but you're not building multiple complementary networks. My biggest concern with the tram plan, though, is how it leaves important investments into core capacity to the future. With the Eastern Ram, Montreal would have had more metro capacity into the city center, traveling from the east. I mentioned talk of the REM cannibalizing ridership on the Green Line, but it doesn't make any sense to talk about how the Green Line's ridership will be cannibalized, while at the same time the STM is talking about how it needs to expand the Green Line's capacity in the not-so-distant future to meet demand. Ultimately, the Eastern Ram plan just wouldn't have expanded metro capacity traveling to the east of the island so much as to make the Green Line a ghost town. But with the tram plan, the Green Line will get busier and there will be no additional line to the city's center, making congestion far worse, including at Berry-UQAM. Suddenly you aren't just talking about a pink line, which feels far off in the future, but also a purple line to relieve the Green Line. Ultimately, with the new suburban tram push, Montreal has a decision. The ARTM criticized the REM plans for mostly serving existing riders. But the reality of the tram plan, which seems inevitable at this point, is that it would be mostly taking existing bus services and putting them on rails. Sure, trams might have dedicated lanes, but so can buses. And that's the Eastern Tram trap. The city spends a ton of money and only gets an incremental improvement on existing bus services that are already and will continue to be far too slow. At the same time, the Green Line becomes even more crowded, and the eastern suburbs don't get the type of service that brings them into the urban fray, and helps to get the region's residents on board with the bigger transit investments that will inevitably be needed, like the Pink Line. So what should we do? I would suggest picking up the plans where the REM de l'Est left off. CDPQ, which has shown itself pretty capable of building above-ground metro, could pick up the eastern and northern parts of the project. Meanwhile, the public agencies could do what they do best and tweak the design of the city center alignment, creating a downtown tunnel probably from around Berry-UQAM to the west, and leveling up connections to the existing REM and metro services at Gare Centrale, Berry, Assomption, and Honoré-Beaugrand, while also probably building stations with a little bit more long-term breathing room. Instead of multiple authorities responsible for building transit fighting and nothing getting built, they could work together and turn a plan that was 90 or 80% good into one that's 100% good, to deliver the transit that Montreal so sorely needs. Thanks for watching.